Every parent faces moments when love feels like cruelty, when doing what's right cuts deep. In the dusty streets of an 1880s frontier town, 12-year-old Ada's desperate cries pierce the morning air as she begs her mother Ruth to return the crutches that have become both her lifeline and her prison. Ruth, a midwife hardened by slavery's painful scars, believes that tough love will force her daughter to walk unaided again. But when wealthy rancher Everett Vaughn hears Ada's heartbreaking pleas, he sees more than a simple family dispute. He sees his own painful journey toward true healing. What happens when three wounded souls discover that true strength isn't about standing alone, but knowing when to lean on others? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted Willow Creek in shades of amber and dust, casting long shadows across the weathered planks of the boardwalk where Ada Morrison sat, with her back against the general store's faded blue wall. Her dark fingers traced the grain of the wooden crutches beside her, smooth from countless hours of gripping, the handles worn to a perfect fit for her small palms. At 12, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that adults found both delightful and unsettling. Her eyes holding depths that seemed far older than her years, the crutches had been her companions for 8 months now, ever since the fever broke and left her legs weak as water. Polio, the traveling doctor had said, with the kind of matter-of-fact tone that doctors used when they wanted to sound reassuring but weren't quite sure themselves. Some children never walked again. Others recovered completely. Ada, he told her mother Ruth, was somewhere in between, a place that felt more like purgatory than hope. Ruth Morrison emerged from Hendrix's store with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, her movements efficient and purposeful as always. At 34, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had learned early that the world demanded strength, and weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her hands, calloused from years of helping women bring life into an often unforgiving world, smoothed the front of her simple grey dress as she approached her daughter. "Time to head home," Ruth said, her voice carrying the soft Alabama drawl that still surfaced despite 15 years in Kansas. "Mrs. Patterson's baby isn't going to wait for our convenience." Ada looked up from her crutches, squinting against the morning light. "Can we stop by the schoolhouse? Miss Eleanor said she had a new book about ancient Rome, and I finished the geography text yesterday." "School can wait, child. We have work to do." The disappointment that flickered across Ada's face was quickly masked by resignation. She'd learned not to argue too hard about such things. In their small world, Ruth's midwifery practice kept food on their table and a roof over their heads. Barely, but enough. Ada's education, while important to Ruth in principle, often took second place to the practical demands of survival. Their home sat on the eastern edge of Willow Creek, a modest cabin that Ruth had purchased with the small inheritance left by her former mistress back in Alabama. It was a gesture that had surprised everyone, including Ruth herself, Mrs. Catherine Millfield, leaving money to the slave who had tended her children and managed her household for 20 years. But Catherine had been different in those final months, perhaps seeking redemption for a lifetime of taking what was freely given. The cabin's whitewashed walls and green shutters stood in neat contrast to the wildness of the prairie that stretched beyond their back door. Ruth had insisted on the whitewash, spending precious dollars on appearances that seemed frivolous to some, but meant everything to a woman who had spent too many years living in quarters where beauty was considered a waste. Inside, the main room served multiple purposes: kitchen, parlor, and workspace all in one. Ruth's medical supplies lined shelves that Ada's father had built before the consumption took him 3 years ago. Glass bottles containing tinctures and herbs caught the light streaming through windows that Ruth cleaned religiously every week. A worn leather bag sat beside the door, always packed and ready for the calls that came at all hours. Ada made her way to the wooden table that served as her desk, settling into the chair her father had crafted specifically for her height. Her crutches leaned against the wall within easy reach, their presence as natural as breathing. She opened her arithmetic book, but her mind wandered to the sounds drifting through the open window. Horses' hooves on hard-packed earth, the distant lowing of cattle, and the occasional shout of men working the land. "Ada," Ruth called from where she was organizing her supplies. "Come help me check these bandages. Mrs. Patterson's going to need clean linens. And I want to make sure we have enough carbolic acid." The girl sighed, but closed her book obediently. This was their routine. Ruth teaching her daughter the practical skills that kept them afloat, while Ada yearned for the broader education that seemed always just out of reach. Ruth had learned to read during the war years, when the chaos of a changing world had created unexpected opportunities. She was determined that Ada would know letters and numbers, but she was equally determined that her daughter would understand the realities of their position in this frontier community. As Ada helped sort through the medical supplies, Ruth studied her daughter's profile. The child had inherited the best of both her parents, her father's keen intellect and her own stubborn determination. But she'd also inherited challenges that neither parent could have anticipated. The weakness in her legs was improving slowly, but some days it seemed to Ruth that Ada was too dependent on those crutches, too willing to accept limitations that might not be permanent. "Mama," Ada said quietly, holding up a small brown bottle. "This one's nearly empty, thank you, baby. We'll need to order more from Kansas City." Ruth paused in her sorting. "Ada, I want you to practice walking without your crutches while I'm with Mrs. Patterson. Just around the cabin, mind you. But your legs are getting stronger, and they need to remember what they're supposed to do." Ada's fingers tightened around the bottle. "They hurt when I try to stand too long. I know they do, but hurt and harm aren't the same thing. The doctor said the muscles need to work to get their strength back." Through the window, they could see the dust cloud that meant a rider was approaching fast. In a community where most travel happened at a leisurely pace, urgency usually meant trouble. Ruth moved to the window and recognized young Tommy Hendricks from his father's store, his horse lathered with sweat. "Mrs. Morrison," he called before he'd even dismounted. "Ma says come quick! Mrs. Patterson's time has come early, and she's asking for you special." Ruth was already reaching for her bag. "Tell your mother I'll be there in 10 minutes. And Tommy, ride easy on your way back. That horse needs water and rest." As the boy galloped away, Ruth turned to her daughter. "Ada, you know what to do. Keep the door locked. Don't answer it for anyone except Dr. Mitchell or Sheriff Hayes, and practice those walking exercises." "Yes, ma'am." Ada's voice was small, but she straightened her shoulders in a gesture that reminded Ruth painfully of her late husband. Ruth paused at the door, her hand on the worn wooden handle. Sometimes she wondered if she was pushing too hard, expecting too much from a child who had already endured more than her share of life's cruelties. But then she remembered the look in certain folks' eyes when they saw Ada with her crutches. Pity mixed with the kind of assumptions that could limit a person's entire future. Ruth had faced those assumptions herself, had fought against them every day since arriving in Willow Creek. She'd be damned if she'd let them define her daughter's life. "I'll be back before supper," she said, leaning down to kiss the top of Ada's head. "And remember what I said about practicing." After her mother left, Ada sat in the sudden quiet of the cabin. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the town beginning its daily rhythm. The blacksmith's hammer ringing against metal, dogs barking at passing wagons, the distant sound of children playing games she couldn't join. She looked at her crutches leaning against the wall, then at her legs folded beneath her chair. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself to standing and took a tentative step forward without reaching for the crutches. Pain shot through her right leg, and she grabbed the edge of the table for support. But she stayed standing, breathing through the discomfort, willing her muscles to remember their purpose. Outside, the morning continued its progression toward noon, and somewhere across town, Everett Vaughn was beginning a day that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. 3 days later, Ruth returned from the Patterson birth with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. The delivery had been difficult, a breech presentation that had taken 36 hours to resolve safely. She'd managed to save both mother and baby, but the strain had left her raw and questioning every decision she made, including the ones concerning her own daughter. Ada was waiting on the front porch when Ruth's borrowed horse plodded up the dusty path. The girl had positioned herself carefully in the rocking chair, her crutches within easy reach but not obviously displayed. She'd spent the 3 days practicing her walking exercises as instructed, pushing herself until her legs trembled and sweat beaded on her forehead. But she'd also spent long hours reading, losing herself in books that transported her far from the confines of their small cabin and her own physical limitations. "How's Mrs. Patterson?" Ada asked as Ruth dismounted slowly, favoring her left hip that always ached after long deliveries. "She and the baby are both fine." Praise God." It was touch and go for a while. Ruth handed the horse's reins to Ada. "Take Belle around back and give her some water. She's earned her rest." As Ada reached for her crutches, Ruth's hand shot out and grasped them first. "No, you can walk Belle to the back without these." Ada's eyes widened. "Mama, I can't." "You can. You've been getting stronger, and it's time to prove it. To yourself, most of all." The confrontation that had been building for months erupted in that moment. Ada's voice rose higher than she'd ever dared before. "Please, Mama, I need them. My legs aren't ready." "Your legs will never be ready if you don't make them work." Ruth's own exhaustion made her voice sharper than she intended. "I've watched you favor those crutches even when you don't need to. You're making yourself more helpless than you have to be." Ada struggled to her feet, her legs already shaking with the effort of supporting her weight unaided. She took one step, then another, but on the third step her right leg buckled. She caught herself against the porch railing, tears of frustration and embarrassment streaming down her face. "See, I can't do it. Why won't you listen to me?" Ruth's resolve wavered for a moment, but then she thought of Mrs. Patterson's struggle, of the way the woman had pushed through impossible pain to bring new life into the world. Sometimes love required cruelty. Sometimes strength demanded sacrifice. "You can do it. You just won't." Ruth turned and walked into the house, taking the crutches with her. Ada's anguished cry followed her. "Mama, please, don't take them away." But Ruth had already disappeared inside, and Ada was left clinging to the porch railing, her legs barely able to support her weight. The horse waited patiently, reins trailing in the dust, while Ada fought back sobs of rage and helplessness. It was then that Everett Vaughn came riding down the main street, returning from his weekly trip to the railroad depot, where he conducted business with cattle buyers from Kansas City and Chicago. He was a man who noticed details, a skill that had served him well in building his ranch into one of the most successful operations in 3 counties. So when he heard the sound of a child crying, not with the temporary distress of a playground injury, but with the deep, desperate anguish of true despair, he reined in his horse and listened. The Vaughn Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres northwest of Willow Creek, but Everett made it his business to know the people in town. Ruth Morrison had delivered the baby of one of his ranch hands 2 summers ago, and he'd heard nothing but praise for her skill and discretion. The sight of her daughter clinging to the Morrison porch railing, tears streaming down her face while she struggled to remain upright, stirred something in him that he thought he'd buried years ago. Everett was 53 years old, with silver threading through dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades spent squinting into prairie sun and wind. His own walking cane, a necessity since a horse had crushed his left leg 15 years earlier, rested against his saddle horn. He'd learned to live with his limitations, but the memory of his own struggle with helplessness remained vivid. He dismounted carefully, his own movements deliberate and measured. Ada didn't notice him at first, too focused on the overwhelming effort of staying upright without support. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, but carried the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Miss Ada, I'm Everett Vaughn. Seems like you could use a hand." Ada's head snapped up, her face flushed with embarrassment. She'd heard of Mr. Vaughn, of course. Everyone in Willow Creek knew about the wealthy rancher who'd made his fortune in cattle and land speculation, but she'd never spoken to him, and certainly never expected him to witness her in such a humiliating state. "I'm fine, sir," she managed, though her grip on the railing betrayed the tremor in her voice. Everett studied her for a moment, recognizing the stubborn pride that reminded him of himself at that age. "I can see that. But that horse there looks mighty thirsty, and I suspect you were heading to give her some water before this difficulty arose." Ada's eyes darted to Belle, who was indeed pawing at the ground and snorting softly. The animal needed care, and Ada was responsible for providing it. But she could barely stand, let alone walk to the back of the cabin. "I can manage," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Everett nodded slowly. "I'm sure you can. But there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. Would you mind if I lent you my arm? I found that sometimes two people can accomplish what one person finds impossible." There was something in his tone, respectful rather than pitying, practical rather than condescending, that made Ada hesitate. She looked at his face and saw understanding rather than judgment. Before she could respond, Ruth emerged from the cabin, her expression set in hard lines. She'd heard voices and come to investigate, expecting to find Ada giving up on her exercise. Instead, she found one of the most influential men in the county standing beside her daughter, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Mr. Vaughn," Ruth said carefully, "I hope Ada hasn't been troubling you." "Not at all, Mrs. Morrison. I was just offering to help her tend to this horse." "Fine animal. Looks like she's had a long ride." Ruth's jaw tightened. "Ada can manage the horse herself. She needs to learn to do things without assistance." "I'm sure she does," Everett replied evenly. "But in my experience, there's a difference between building strength and creating unnecessary struggle. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is offer support while someone finds their footing." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond the immediate situation. Ada looked between her mother and Mr. Vaughn, sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand, but feeling the tension that crackled between the two adults. Ruth's voice was tight when she spoke. "With respect, Mr. Vaughn, Ada is my daughter. I know what's best for her." "Of course you do," Everett said. "You're her mother, and clearly you love her deeply. But sometimes we all need reminding that strength comes in many forms." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew his walking cane, polished oak with a brass handle that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Without ceremony, he handed it to Ada. "Use this to get Belle to the water trough. Consider it borrowed assistance, not a permanent solution." Ada accepted the cane with trembling fingers and immediately felt the relief of having support. She took a tentative step, then another, growing more confident as she realized she could move without the constant fear of falling. Ruth watched this exchange with growing alarm and anger. This wealthy white man was undermining her authority, making her look like a cruel mother in front of her own daughter. But beneath the anger was a deeper fear that maybe, just maybe, she was wrong about what Ada needed. As Ada made her way slowly but steadily toward the back of the cabin, with Belle in tow, Everett turned to Ruth with an expression that was understanding but firm. "Mrs. Morrison, I don't presume to know your situation or your struggles, but I do know something about the challenge of recovering from an injury that changes how the world sees you. Sometimes healing requires patience as much as pushing." Ruth's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Mr. Vaughn, I appreciate your concern, but—" "Mama, I made it!" Ada's voice called from behind the cabin, filled with triumph and relief. The sound stopped Ruth's words in her throat. When had she last heard such joy in her daughter's voice? When had accomplishment sounded so much like celebration rather than grim endurance? Everett tipped his hat politely. "I'll collect my cane when your daughter is finished with the horse." "No hurry at all." As he walked away, Ruth stood alone on her porch, wondering if love and strength were truly the same thing, or if she'd been confusing cruelty with care for longer than she cared to admit. The letter arrived 3 days after Everett's unexpected intervention, delivered by young Tommy Hendricks with the same urgency he brought to all his errands. Ruth accepted the cream-colored envelope with suspicion. Few people in Willow Creek conducted business through formal correspondence, and the expensive paper suggested a sender with means. Inside, written in careful script on Vaughn Ranch letterhead, was an invitation that made Ruth's stomach tighten with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Mrs. Morrison, I would be honored if you and Miss Ada would join me for Sunday dinner this week. I have a proposition that might interest you both regarding Miss Ada's education and your medical practice. Please don't feel obligated to accept, but know that the invitation comes with genuine respect for your family's independence and dignity. Most sincerely, Everett Vaughn. P.S. Miss Ada's assistance with Belle was exemplary. I hope she'll allow me the pleasure of thanking her properly. Ada read the letter over her mother's shoulder, her eyes widening with each line. Mama, he wants to talk about my education. Do you think... I think Mr. Vaughn is a man accustomed to getting his way through charm and money, Ruth interrupted, though her tone lacked the sharp edge it might have carried a week earlier. We don't need his charity, Ada, but even as she spoke, Ruth felt the weight of their circumstances pressing down on her. Mrs. Patterson's delivery had paid well, but there wouldn't be another birth for several weeks. Their food stores were adequate, but not abundant, and Ada's appetite for books far exceeded what Ruth could afford to purchase. The girl had read every volume in their small collection at least twice, and Miss Eleanor at the schoolhouse had begun lending Ada her personal books, a kindness that Ruth appreciated, but also found mildly humiliating. Ada sensed her mother's internal struggle. Over the past few days, since borrowing Mr. Vaughn's cane to care for Belle, something had shifted between them. Ruth hadn't returned Ada's crutches, but she also hadn't forced her daughter to walk entirely unaided. Instead, they'd settled into an uneasy compromise, where Ada used a single crutch for stability, while gradually building strength in her legs. What if it's not charity? Ada asked carefully. What if he just wants to be neighborly? Ruth's laugh was short and bitter. Men like Everett Vaughn don't invite people like us to Sunday dinner out of neighborliness, child. He wants something. Maybe he wants to give something. The simple statement hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Ruth had learned to be suspicious of gifts from white folks, especially wealthy ones. There were always strings attached, always expectations that could trap a person in obligations they never intended to accept. But she'd also seen the way Everett had spoken to Ada, with respect rather than condescension, offering help without making her feel diminished. And God knew Ada deserved opportunities that Ruth couldn't provide alone. We'll go, Ruth decided suddenly. But we'll be clear about our boundaries from the start. We're not looking for handouts, and we won't be beholden to anyone. Ada's face lit up with excitement and something else, hope, perhaps, or simply the prospect of an adventure beyond their small world. What should I wear? I don't have anything fancy enough for a ranch house dinner. You'll wear your blue dress with the white collar. It's clean and respectable, and that's all that matters. We're not trying to impress anyone. But as Ruth spoke, she found herself mentally cataloguing her own limited wardrobe, wondering if any of her dresses were suitable for dining with one of the wealthiest men in the county. The thought irritated her. She'd worked hard to build a life where her worth wasn't measured by her appearance or her ability to please white folks. Yet here she was, worrying about making the right impression. That evening, as Ada practiced her walking exercises in the main room of their cabin, Ruth sat at the kitchen table mending a tear in her best dress. The needle moved steadily through the dark fabric while her mind wandered over the events of the past week. She'd been so certain that tough love was what Ada needed, so convinced that allowing her daughter to depend on crutches would create permanent weakness. But watching Ada navigate their daily routines with Mr. Vaughn's borrowed cane had forced Ruth to confront some uncomfortable truths. The girl moved with more confidence when she felt secure, tackled challenges more willingly when she wasn't constantly afraid of falling. Perhaps there was wisdom in graduated assistance rather than complete independence. Mamai, Ada's voice interrupted her thoughts. Are you angry about accepting Mr. Vaughn's invitation? Ruth looked up from her mending to find her daughter leaning against the wall, breathing hard from her exercises, but standing steadily. "I'm not angry, baby. I'm cautious. There's a difference, but you don't trust him. I don't know him well enough to trust him, and in my experience, when powerful people take an interest in folks like us, it's usually because they want something in return." Ada considered this, her young face serious with concentration. What if what he wants is to help? What if helping us helps him somehow? The question was more sophisticated than Ruth had expected from her 12-year-old daughter, and it made her realize that Ada was growing up faster than she'd acknowledged. The girl had always been intelligent, but recent challenges had forced her to develop emotional maturity beyond her years. "That's possible," Ruth admitted, "but we need to be prepared for disappointment. Men like Mr. Vaughn live in a different world than we do. Their problems and solutions might not match ours. I understand, Mama, but I still want to go. Even if nothing comes of it, I want to see his ranch and hear what he has to say." Ruth nodded slowly. "Then we'll go. But Ada, promise me you won't get your hopes up too high. And promise me you'll remember that whatever he offers, we have the right to say no. I promise." That night, as Ada slept deeply after her exercises, Ruth sat by the window, looking out at the star-filled prairie sky. In the distance, she could see the lights of the Vaughn ranch house twinkling like earthbound stars. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of emotions, longing for the security that such wealth could provide, resentment at the unfairness of their different circumstances, and fear that accepting Everett's invitation would somehow compromise the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. But beneath all those complicated feelings was something simpler and more powerful: a mother's love for her daughter and the desire to give her every possible opportunity to thrive. If Everett Vaughn truly had something to offer that could improve Ada's prospects, then Ruth owed it to her child to listen with an open mind. The question was whether she could do so without losing the hard-won dignity that had carried them this far. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the prairie seem endless and full of possibility. Ruth helped Ada into her best dress, braided her hair with special care, and tried to ignore the flutter of nervousness in her own stomach. As they prepared to leave for the Vaughn ranch, Ada turned to her mother with an expression of mature gratitude that nearly broke Ruth's heart. "Thank you, Mama, for saying yes. I know it's not easy for you." Ruth smoothed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "Nothing about raising you has been easy, Ada Morrison, but it's been the greatest privilege of my life." Together, they stepped out into the morning sunshine, ready to face whatever Everett Vaughn's proposition might bring to their carefully ordered world. Vaughn Ranch House rose from the prairie like something out of Ada's storybooks, 2 stories of whitewashed wood and stone with a wraparound porch that seemed to stretch for miles. As their borrowed wagon approached the circular drive, Ada pressed her face to the window, drinking in details that spoke of wealth beyond her imagination: manicured flower beds, a carriage house larger than most homes in Willow Creek, and horses grazing in paddocks that stretched to the horizon. Ruth felt her own sense of intimidation growing with each yard they traveled up the long drive. The hired man who had driven them from town, a courteous older gentleman named Marcus, seemed to sense her discomfort. "Mr. Vaughn's good people," Marcus said quietly. "Treats his workers fair, pays honest wages, doesn't put on airs despite having more money than most folks know what to do with. He's got his sorrows like anyone, but they've made him kinder rather than bitter." Ruth appreciated the reassurance, though she wondered what sorrows a wealthy white man could possibly have that would compare to the struggles she'd faced. Still, there was something in Marcus's tone that suggested genuine affection for his employer rather than mere professional loyalty. Everett emerged from the house as their wagon pulled up to the front steps, moving with the careful gait of someone whose body had been broken and mended imperfectly. His Sunday clothes were well-tailored but not ostentatious, the attire of a successful man who had no need to prove his status through display. "Mrs. Morrison, Miss Ada, welcome to my home." His greeting was warm but formal. striking the right balance between hospitality and respect for their independence. I hope the ride wasn't too uncomfortable. As he helped Ada down from the wagon, she noticed that his walking cane was different from the one he'd lent her. This one was clearly functional rather than decorative, worn smooth from years of constant use. The sight reassured her somehow, evidence that his understanding of her challenges came from personal experience rather than mere sympathy. The interior of the house was both grander and more comfortable than Ada had expected. The furniture was well made, but arranged for use rather than show, and books lined the walls of every room they passed through. Ruth noted the absence of a woman's touch in the decor, no delicate ornaments or decorative touches that might suggest a wife's presence. "I thought we might dine on the back porch," Everett said, leading them through the house. "The view is particularly fine today, and the breeze makes for pleasant conversation." The back porch overlooked a vista that took Ada's breath away, rolling hills dotted with cattle, a creek meandering through cottonwood trees, and prairie stretching to purple mountains in the distance. A table had been set for three with simple but elegant china, and the smell of roasted chicken drifted from the kitchen. "Mr. Vaughn," Ruth began carefully, "before we sit down to your hospitality, I need to understand what you want from us. In my experience, invitations like this come with expectations." Everett nodded approvingly. "Direct speaking, I respect that. You're right to be cautious, Mrs. Morrison. I do have a proposition, but I hope you'll hear me out before making any decisions." They settled around the table as a middle-aged woman emerged from the kitchen carrying platters of food that made Ada's mouth water. The abundance was overwhelming, not just the quantity, but the quality and variety that spoke of resources she could barely imagine. "This is Mrs. Chen," Everett said, introducing the woman who served them with quiet efficiency. "She manages my household and cooks better than anyone in 3 counties. Mrs. Chen, these are my guests, Mrs. Morrison and her daughter Ada." Mrs. Chen smiled warmly at them both. "Very pleased to meet you. Mr. Vaughn has spoken of you with great respect." As they began to eat, Everett shared his proposition with the careful deliberation of a man accustomed to important negotiations. "Miss Ada, I understand you have a hunger for learning that exceeds what our local school can provide. Is that accurate?" Ada glanced at her mother before answering. "Yes, sir. I love to read, and I'd like to study subjects that aren't available here. History, literature, maybe even some science. And Mrs. Morrison, your medical practice serves an important need in our community. But I suspect you could expand your services if you had access to better supplies and more advanced training. Am I correct?" Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Vaughn?" "I'm suggesting a partnership that benefits all of us. I have connections in Kansas City, doctors who could provide you with advanced training in modern medical techniques, suppliers who could outfit you with better equipment. And I have access to tutors and educational resources that could accelerate Miss Ada's learning far beyond what she could achieve locally." The offer hung in the air between them, too generous and too perfect to be entirely trustworthy. Ruth felt her defenses rising, even as her practical mind calculated the opportunities such resources could provide. "What would you want in return?" she asked bluntly. Everett set down his fork and looked directly at her. "I want to establish a proper medical clinic in Willow Creek, with you as the head practitioner. I want to fund advanced education for promising young people like Ada, starting with private tutoring here and eventually supporting their attendance at Eastern colleges." Ada's gasp was audible. "College for me?" "For you and others like you. Intelligence and determination shouldn't be limited by circumstances of birth or current financial status." Ruth's mind raced through the implications. "Why? What's your real motivation for this generosity?" For the first time since they'd arrived, Everett's composure seemed to crack slightly. He stood and walked to the porch railing, gazing out at his vast holdings with an expression that suggested profound loneliness despite his material success. "Mrs. Morrison, have you ever noticed that photograph on the mantelpiece in my study?" Ruth shook her head. They hadn't been in his study. It shows my son, Thomas. He would have been about Ada's age now, brilliant and eager to learn about everything the world had to offer. He died of pneumonia 8 years ago, despite all my money and the best doctors I could summon from Chicago and St. Louis. The revelation hit both women like a physical blow. Ada's eyes filled with tears of sympathy, while Ruth felt her assumptions about Everett's motivations shifting fundamentally. "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruth said quietly. Everett nodded acknowledgement but continued. "Thomas had a hunger for knowledge that reminded me of Miss Ada, and his death taught me that money without purpose is just another form of poverty. I can't bring my son back, but I can honor his memory by helping other children reach their potential." "And my medical practice?" Ruth asked. "This community needs better health care. You have the skill and dedication, but you lack resources. I have resources, but lack the medical knowledge. It seems to me we could accomplish more together than either of us could manage alone." The honesty of his grief and the practical wisdom of his proposal began to break down Ruth's resistance. But years of hard-won independence made her cautious about accepting help, especially from someone whose social position gave him automatic advantages in any partnership. "We'd need guarantees," she said slowly. "Written agreements that protect our autonomy and ensure we can't be dismissed on a whim." "Of course. I'd insist on formal contracts that protect everyone's interests." Ada looked between the two adults, sensing that her entire future hung in the balance of this conversation. The possibility of real education, of studying subjects that challenged her mind and prepared her for a larger world, was almost too wonderful to believe. But she also understood her mother's hesitation. They'd built their lives through their own efforts, and accepting help always carried the risk of becoming dependent on someone else's goodwill. "Mama," she said quietly, "could we think about it? Just consider the possibilities?" Ruth saw the hope shining in her daughter's eyes and felt her resolve wavering. Perhaps there were times when pride had to yield to practical opportunity. Perhaps the strength to accept help was just as important as the strength to stand alone. "We'll think about it," she said finally. "But Mr. Vaughn, you need to understand, we won't be anybody's charity cases or pet projects. If we do this, it has to be as equals, with mutual respect and clearly defined expectations." Everett's smile was the first completely genuine expression he'd shown all afternoon. "Mrs. Morrison, I wouldn't have it any other way. Equals, with mutual respect, working toward goals that benefit us all." As the afternoon sun slanted across the porch and the conversation moved to lighter topics, all three began to sense that this meal might be the beginning of something that could change their lives in ways they were only beginning to imagine. The whispers started. On Monday morning, Ruth first noticed them at Henderson's General Store, where conversations that had been flowing freely suddenly grew muted when she entered. Mrs. Fletcher, who had always greeted her warmly, barely nodded before turning her attention to arranging already organized bolts of fabric. The silence felt deliberate, weighted with judgment and speculation. "Morning, Mrs. Morrison," Tom Henderson called from behind the counter, his usual friendliness intact, but tinged with something that might have been curiosity or concern. "Heard you and Ada had Sunday dinner up at the Vaughn place. Must have been quite an experience." The words were neutral enough, but Ruth caught the undertone of incredulity. In a community where social boundaries were clearly defined, dining with Everett Vaughn represented a crossing of lines that made people uncomfortable. "It was very pleasant," Ruth replied evenly, selecting the items she needed without lingering for conversation. But she felt eyes following her movements, and when she stepped outside, she caught sight of two women across the street pulling their heads together in animated discussion. Ada experienced her own version of the town's reaction when she returned to school on Tuesday. Miss Eleanor greeted her with genuine warmth, but several of her classmates regarded her with new curiosity that bordered on suspicion. "My pa says you ate off real china and had servants waiting on you," Mary Hendricks said during recess, her tone suggesting Ada had somehow betrayed their shared status as ordinary townspeople. "Mrs. Chen isn't a servant," Ada replied carefully. "She's Mr. Vaughn's housekeeper, and she was very kind. My mama says colored folks who get too friendly with rich white men always end up regretting it," added Sarah Mitchell, the sheriff's daughter, with the casual cruelty that children sometimes displayed. Ada felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she also felt something else, a growing understanding of the complex social currents that her mother navigated daily. She was beginning to see that acceptance of Everett's offer would mean more than just educational opportunities. It would mean stepping outside the boundaries that defined their place in the community. That evening, as they sat together at their kitchen table, Ruth broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "Ada, I need you to understand what accepting Mr. Vaughn's proposition would mean for us. It's not just about the opportunities. It's about how people will see us, how they'll treat us." Ada set down her arithmetic book and gave her mother her full attention. "You mean like what happened at school today?" "What happened at school?" Ada recounted the playground conversation, watching her mother's expression grow increasingly troubled. "I don't understand why people are upset that we had dinner with him. He was nothing but kind to us." Ruth sighed deeply, struggling to explain concepts that she herself sometimes found difficult to navigate. "It's complicated, baby. In this world, there are rules about who associates with whom, rules that most folks don't even think about because they've always existed. When we break those rules, even for good reasons, it makes people nervous. That's not fair. No, it's not. But fairness and reality aren't always the same thing." Ruth stood and moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Willow Creek in the growing dusk. "I've spent 15 years building a life here, establishing myself as someone folks could trust and respect. If we align ourselves too closely with Mr. Vaughn, some people might think we've gotten above our station or that we're not one of them anymore. But Mama, you help everyone who needs medical care. You've saved lives, delivered babies, cared for people when no one else could help them. How could that change just because we accept Mr. Vaughn's offer?" The question revealed both Ada's innocence and her intuitive understanding of justice. Ruth felt a familiar ache in her chest, the pain of watching her daughter confront the unfairness of the world they lived in. "Some folks will always see us first as colored people, and only second as individuals with our own merits. When we associate with wealthy white men, it makes them question our motives and our loyalties." Ada was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "What do you think we should do?" Ruth returned to the table and took her daughter's hands in her own. "I think we need to make a decision based on what's best for our future, not on what makes other people comfortable. But I also need you to understand that if we say yes to Mr. Vaughn, our lives here will change. Some changes might be wonderful, better education for you, expanded opportunities for my practice. But some changes might be difficult. Would you regret it?" "Saying yes?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "I might regret saying no more than I'd regret saying yes. You have a brilliant mind, Ada, and it deserves every opportunity to flourish. If I let my fears or other people's prejudices limit your potential, I'd never forgive myself." That night, after Ada had gone to bed, Ruth sat at her kitchen table writing 2 letters. The first was to her cousin Martha in Kansas City, asking about opportunities for medical training and the reputation of the doctors Everett had mentioned. The second was to the teacher who had helped her learn to read during the war years, seeking advice about educational opportunities for gifted children. She wanted to make an informed decision rather than one based purely on emotion or immediate need. If they were going to step into a new life, she wanted to understand all the implications beforehand. Wednesday brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Mitchell arrived at their cabin in the early afternoon, his weathered face serious with concern. Ruth invited him in, offering coffee and wondering what had brought the elderly physician to her door. "Ruth, I'll speak plainly because I respect you too much for anything else," he began, settling into a chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen too many years of hard use. "There's talk in town about your association with Everett Vaughn. Some of it's just idle gossip, but some of it concerns me." Ruth felt her spine stiffen. "What kind of concerns?" The kind that suggests some folks think you might be getting ideas above your station. The kind that could affect your practice if people start questioning your judgment or your loyalties. The words hit Ruth like physical blows, confirming her worst fears about the community's reaction. Dr. Mitchell, I've never done anything to compromise my professional integrity or my commitment to this community. I know that, and anyone with sense knows that. But sense isn't always what drives public opinion. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Ruth, you're the finest midwife I've ever worked with, and this community needs your skills. But if you're thinking about accepting whatever Vaughn's offered you, you need to consider the potential consequences carefully. And if I don't accept his offer, if I let fear of other people's reactions limit my daughter's opportunities. Dr. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment. That's the devil's choice, isn't it? Damned if you do, damned if you don't. After he left, Ruth sat alone in her cabin, feeling the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her. On one side lay safety, the familiar rhythms of a life she'd built through her own efforts. On the other side lay opportunity, the chance to give Ada advantages that might transform her entire future. But between those choices lay a minefield of social expectations, racial prejudices, and community dynamics that could explode in ways she couldn't predict or control. When Ada returned from school that afternoon, she found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by half-written letters and the kind of stillness that suggested deep, troubled thinking. "Mama, are you all right?" Ruth looked up at her daughter, intelligent, determined, full of potential that deserved every chance to flourish, and felt her resolve beginning to crystallize. "I'm thinking, baby. Just thinking about what kind of future we want to build, and what we're willing to risk to build it." Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying with it the promise of change and the uncertainty that change always brought. Thursday's dawn brought more than just another day. It brought Everett Vaughn riding up to their cabin with a purpose that radiated from his very posture. Ruth watched through the window as he dismounted carefully, noting the deliberate way he moved and the manila envelope he carried. Something had changed since their Sunday dinner, and she suspected their decision time had accelerated beyond their control. "Mrs. Morrison," he said when she opened the door before he could knock, "I apologize for the early hour, but I felt it important to speak with you before you heard certain information from other sources." Ruth's stomach tightened. "What information?" "May I come in?" "This conversation requires privacy." She led him to the kitchen table, where Ada joined them, her schoolbooks forgotten as she sensed the gravity of the moment. Everett placed the envelope on the table between them, his expression troubled. "I received a telegram yesterday from my business associates in Kansas City. It seems word of our dinner has reached certain circles there, and the reaction has been complicated." Ruth felt a chill despite the warmth of the morning. "Complicated how?" "Some of my business partners are questioning my judgment in what they perceive as a social impropriety. Others are concerned about potential impacts on our various enterprises." He paused, meeting Ruth's eyes directly. "I want you to understand that their concerns have nothing to do with your character or qualifications, and everything to do with prejudices that I find personally reprehensible." Ada's voice was small when she spoke. "Does this mean you're taking back your offer?" Everett's expression softened as he looked at her. "Miss Ada, it means I'm more determined than ever to see this partnership succeed. But it also means we need to be strategic about how we proceed." He opened the envelope and withdrew several documents. "I've spent the past 2 days consulting with lawyers and making arrangements. These are formal contracts for both the medical clinic and your educational sponsorship, drawn up in a way that protects all parties involved." Ruth examined the papers with growing amazement. The terms were more generous than anything they'd discussed, but also more formal and binding than she'd expected. "Mr. Vaughn, this level of legal documentation suggests you're expecting serious opposition to our arrangement. I'm preparing for opposition, not expecting it. There's a difference." His voice carried the hardness of a man accustomed to business conflicts. "I've learned that when you're planning to challenge social conventions, it's better to have everything documented clearly from the beginning." Ruth read through the clinic agreement, noting provisions for her autonomy, equipment funding, and a salary that would triple her current income. The educational contract for Ada was even more remarkable, covering private tutoring immediately and full college expenses when she reached the appropriate age. "This is incredibly generous," Ruth said slowly. "But I have to ask, what happens to us if you change your mind, or if the pressure from your business associates becomes too great?" Everett leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since they'd met him, he looked every one of his 53 years. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to tell you something that I've never shared with anyone in Willow Creek, something that might help you understand why this partnership matters to me beyond mere philanthropy." He was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts or perhaps his courage. "My son Thomas wasn't just intelligent, he was also half Cherokee. His mother was a remarkable woman named Sarah Whitehorse, who taught me more about courage and dignity than any man has a right to learn." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Ruth felt her assumptions about Everett reshuffling completely, while Ada's eyes widened with understanding. "Sarah died in childbirth with our second child, who didn't survive either. Thomas and I were left to navigate a world that wasn't particularly welcoming to mixed families, even when one parent had money and social position." Ruth's voice was gentle when she spoke. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was. But it also taught me something important about the difference between acceptance that's given freely and acceptance that's earned through struggle. Thomas never got the chance to prove what he could accomplish in this world, but you and Ada do." Ada's question was direct and innocent. "Is that why you understand about people treating you differently?" "Partly, yes. When folks found out about Thomas's heritage, some of them couldn't see past it to recognize his intelligence and potential. I watched my son navigate challenges that no child should have to face, and it changed how I see the world." Ruth set down the contracts and studied Everett's face. "So this isn't really about charity or guilt. It's about justice. It's about giving people the opportunities they deserve based on their abilities, not their circumstances of birth." He met her gaze steadily. "But I need you to understand that accepting this offer might bring you the same kind of challenges that Thomas faced. People will question your motives, your qualifications, your right to opportunities that others take for granted." The honesty was both refreshing and daunting. Ruth appreciated his directness, but she also felt the weight of responsibility for Ada's future pressing down on her. "What do you think we should do, baby?" she asked her daughter. Ada looked between the two adults, her young face serious with concentration. "I think we should be brave. Mama, you've always taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing. If Mr. Vaughn is offering us a chance to build something better, something that could help other people too, then maybe we have to take that chance." Ruth felt pride and fear warring in her chest. Her daughter's courage humbled her, but it also reminded her of the enormous responsibility she carried as Ada's protector and guide. "There's one more thing," Everett said quietly. "I've arranged for you to meet with Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell in Kansas City next month. She's one of the finest physicians in the country, and she's particularly interested in expanding medical opportunities for women and minorities." Ada gasped. "The Dr. Blackwell? The first woman doctor?" "The very same. She's agreed to evaluate your current skills, Mrs. Morrison, and to recommend a program of advanced training that would make you one of the most qualified medical practitioners in this region." The offer was so extraordinary that Ruth felt almost dizzy. Dr. Blackwell was a legend, a woman who had fought through barriers that made Ruth's own struggles seem modest by comparison. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really, truly, why risk your business relationships and social standing for us?" Everett stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. Because Thomas asked me to the night before he died. He was 8 years old, fighting for every breath. And he made me promise that I'd help other children who had dreams bigger than their circumstances. When he turned back to them, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I've spent 8 years trying to figure out how to keep that promise. When I saw Ada struggling with her crutches while her mother fought to help her in the only way she knew how, I finally understood what he'd been asking me to do. Ruth looked at the contracts spread across her kitchen table, then at her daughter's hopeful face, then at the man who was offering to change their lives completely. If we do this, she said slowly, there's no going back. Win or lose, succeed or fail, we'll have crossed a line that changes everything. I know, Everett replied. The question is whether we're brave enough to cross it together. Ada reached across the table and placed her small hand over her mother's. Mama, I think we are. Ruth covered her daughter's hand with her own, feeling the weight of the decision and the lightness of possibility in equal measure. Then I guess we're about to find out just how brave we really are. The faded daguerreotype fell from between the pages of Ruth's mother's Bible as she packed her most precious possessions for the trip to Kansas City. The image hit the floor with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the cabin. Ada, who had been folding clothes nearby, looked up to see her mother frozen in place, staring down at the photograph with an expression of absolute shock. Mama, what is it? Ruth's hands trembled as she picked up the daguerreotype, her eyes fixed on the image with an intensity that made Ada deeply uneasy. The photograph showed a young woman in a simple dress standing beside a tall man in what appeared to be a military uniform. But it was the child between them, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, that had captured Ruth's attention so completely. Mama, you're scaring me. What's wrong? Ruth sank into the nearest chair, the photograph clutched in her hands. Ada, baby, come here. I need to show you something. And I need to tell you a story I've never told anyone. Ada approached cautiously, her earlier excitement about their upcoming journey to Kansas City forgotten in the face of her mother's obvious distress. When she was close enough to see the photograph clearly, she gasped in recognition. The boy in the image had the same distinctive mixed features, the same intelligent eyes, the same serious expression that she'd seen in the portrait on Everett Vaughn's mantelpiece. But this photograph was much older, and the people standing with the child were strangers to her. Mama, that boy, he looks like Thomas Vaughn. Yes, baby, he does. Ruth's voice was barely above a whisper. Because this is Thomas Vaughn, but not the Thomas that Mr. Vaughn told us about. Ada felt the world shifting beneath her feet. I don't understand. Ruth closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with 20 years of carefully buried pain. The woman in this photograph is my sister Catherine. The man is her husband, Lieutenant James Morrison. And the child? The child is my nephew, Thomas Morrison. The words fell between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Ada stared at the photograph, then at her mother, trying to process information that made no sense with what they'd been told. But Mr. Vaughn said his son was named Thomas, and that his mother was Cherokee. Sarah Whitehorse Morrison was my sister. She was Cherokee, but she was also Catherine to most of the white world she had to navigate. She married James Morrison in 1854, and they had a son they named Thomas. Ruth's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if telling the truth after so many years was lifting a weight she'd carried too long. Ada's mind raced through the implications. You mean Mr. Vaughn's son Thomas was your nephew? Your family? My family. My sister's child. The boy I helped raise until he was 3 years old. Before James got his military assignment to Kansas and they moved away from Alabama, Ruth stood and walked to the window, the photograph still clutched in her hands. I lost touch with them during the war years. Communications were disrupted, people moved constantly, and by the time things settled down, I couldn't find any trace of where they'd gone. Why didn't you tell Mr. Vaughn when he mentioned his son? Why didn't you say anything? Ruth's laugh was bitter and full of old pain. Because I wasn't sure, Ada. 20 years is a long time, and Thomas is a common name. Because I was afraid to hope, afraid to open old wounds, afraid that I might be wrong. She turned back to her daughter, her expression complex with emotions Ada was only beginning to understand. And because I wasn't sure if a white man who'd inherited a Cherokee woman's child would want to acknowledge her colored sister, the revelation recontextualized everything about their recent interactions with Everett. His immediate understanding of their struggles, his generous offer, his emotional investment in Ada's education, none of it had been about guilt or charity. It had been about family, about connections that ran deeper than any of them had realized. Mama, we have to tell him. He has a right to know that we're family. Do we, baby? Do we really? Ruth's voice carried 20 years of accumulated caution. What if knowing the truth changes how he sees us? What if it makes him feel obligated rather than genuinely caring? What if he doesn't want Cherokee family connecting him to colored family? Ada struggled to understand the complex social dynamics that her mother navigated so carefully. But Mama, if we're family, doesn't that make everything different? Better, or it might make everything worse. Family connections can be chains as easily as they can be bonds, especially when they cross racial lines. Before Ada could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Through the window, they could see Everett riding up with two other men, well-dressed strangers who carried themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to authority. Ruth quickly slipped the photograph into her apron pocket. Ada, don't say anything about what we just discovered, not yet. Let me think about this, figure out the right way to handle it. Everett's expression was grim as he approached the cabin, and his companions looked like men bearing unpleasant news. Ruth's sense of foreboding deepened as she opened the door to greet them. Mrs. Morrison, Everett said without preamble, I'm afraid we have a problem. These gentlemen are Mr. Harrison and Mr. Clark from the territorial government. They have some questions about our business arrangements. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his manner officious and condescending. Mrs. Morrison, we've received complaints about irregular business practices involving Mr. Vaughn's recent contracts with you. There are concerns about the propriety of such arrangements between parties of different social standings. Ruth felt her spine stiffen. I'm not aware of any irregularities in our contracts, sir. Everything has been properly documented and legally executed. Nevertheless, Mr. Clark interjected, the territorial authority has the right to review any business arrangements that might affect community stability or proper social order. The threat was politely phrased, but unmistakable. Ruth realized that forces beyond their small community were aligning against their partnership, forces with the power to disrupt everything they'd planned. Everett's voice was tight with controlled anger. Gentlemen, I've operated legitimate businesses in this territory for 15 years without any complaints about my judgment or my associations. I find it curious that questions arise only when I choose to partner with qualified individuals who happen to be colored. Mr. Vaughn, Harrison replied smoothly, no one is questioning your right to conduct business. But certain arrangements raise questions about motivation and appropriateness that the territorial government cannot ignore. Ada watched this exchange with growing alarm, understanding that the adult world was far more complicated and dangerous than she'd realized. The opportunity that had seemed so promising just hours earlier was already under attack from sources she couldn't have imagined. Ruth felt the photograph in her pocket like a burning coal. Here was information that might change everything, proof of family connections that could either legitimize their partnership or create entirely new complications. The knowledge that Everett was unknowingly helping his own family might provide emotional leverage, but it might also expose vulnerabilities that their enemies could exploit. Gentlemen, Everett said with dangerous quiet, I think this conversation would be better continued in my study. With proper legal representation present, Mrs. Morrison shouldn't be subjected to interrogation about legitimate business contracts. As the men prepared to leave, Harrison turned back to Ruth with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Morrison, I trust you understand that certain opportunities come with certain expectations. The territorial government values stability and order above all else. After they rode away, Ruth and Ada stood in their dooryard, both shaken by the encounter and its implications. The photograph in Ruth's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets that could change everything or destroy everything, depending on how they were revealed. "Mama," Ada said quietly, "what are we going to do?" Ruth looked at her daughter, intelligent, brave, deserving of every opportunity the world could offer, and felt the complexity of their situation pressing down on her like a physical weight. "I don't know, baby, but I think it's time to tell Mr. Vaughn the truth about who we really are. Whatever the consequences, he deserves to know that when he's fighting for us, he's fighting for family." The prairie wind whispered through the grass around their cabin, carrying with it the promise of storms on the horizon and the knowledge that some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. The evening light cast long shadows across the Vaughn ranch as Ruth and Ada approached the main house. The daguerreotype wrapped carefully in Ruth's best handkerchief and tucked inside her medical bag. The weight of 20 years of buried truth seemed to press against Ruth's chest with each step, making breathing difficult and her heart race with anticipation and dread in equal measure. Everett met them at the door, his face drawn with the strain of the day's confrontations. "Mrs. Morrison, Ada, thank you for coming. I know today's events were disturbing, but I want you to know that I have no intention of backing down from our agreements because of pressure from territorial bureaucrats." "Mr. Vaughn," Ruth said quietly, "before we discuss how to handle the government officials, there's something I need to tell you, something that changes everything about our relationship and our situation." Something in her tone made Everett pause, his eyes sharpening with attention. "Of course. Please come into my study where we can speak privately." The study was a comfortable room, lined with books and decorated with mementos from Everett's business ventures and personal life. On the mantelpiece sat the portrait of Thomas that had first caught Ada's attention, the boy whose intelligent eyes and mixed heritage had touched her heart even before she understood the connection. Ruth settled into a chair facing that portrait, gathering her courage for what might be the most important conversation of her life. Ada sat beside her, offering silent support while Everett took his place behind his desk. Clearly prepared to discuss legal strategies and political maneuvering, "Mr. Vaughn," Ruth began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "what I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to listen with an open mind and heart." She withdrew the daguerreotype from her medical bag, unwrapping it with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred relics. "This photograph belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died, along with stories about family members I'd lost touch with during the war years." Everett's expression grew puzzled as Ruth handed him the photograph. But when his eyes focused on the image, his face went completely white. The daguerreotype shook in his hands as he stared at the faces of people he'd thought were lost to him forever. "This is," he began, his voice breaking with emotion, "this is Sarah Whitehorse Morrison, who was my older sister Catherine. This is Lieutenant James Morrison, her husband. And this is their son, Thomas Morrison, who I believe grew up to become your adopted son." The silence that followed was so complete that Ada could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Everett's eyes moved from the photograph to Ruth's face, searching for confirmation of what seemed impossible but felt absolutely true. "Sarah was your sister," he said slowly, as if testing the words for their weight and meaning. "My half-sister, born to my mother and a Cherokee man who worked on the plantation where we lived. Mama was a house slave, but Catherine was born free because her father claimed her according to Cherokee law. She was able to pass in white society when necessary, but she never forgot where she came from or who her people were." Everett stood abruptly and walked to the window, the photograph still clutched in his hands. "She never mentioned having family. In all the years we were together, through all our struggles, she never told me about you." Ruth's voice was gentle with understanding. "That was probably to protect you, Mr. Vaughn, and to protect Thomas. Having known connections to colored family would have complicated your lives in ways that Sarah was probably trying to spare you. But you knew, Everett said, turning back to face them. When I told you about Thomas, about Sarah, you knew we were talking about your family. I suspected. But I wasn't certain until I found that photograph tonight. And even then, I wasn't sure whether telling you would help or hurt what we're trying to build together. Ada watched the two adults navigate this revelation, understanding that they were rewriting the foundation of their entire relationship. What had seemed like charity or even justice was now revealed as something much more personal and complicated: family loyalty, blood connections that transcended racial boundaries, and obligations that went deeper than legal contracts. Everett returned to his chair, studying Ruth's face with new eyes. You look like her. Around the eyes, in the way you hold yourself when you're determined about something. I should have seen it before. 20 years and hard living change people. Mr. Vaughn, and you had no reason to look for resemblances. Thomas had your stubbornness, Everett said suddenly, a smile breaking through his emotional turmoil. And your way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of complicated matters. I used to wonder where he got that particular talent. Ruth felt tears threatening as memories of her young nephew surfaced. The bright boy who had followed her around the cabin, asking endless questions, who had inherited the best qualities of both his parents, and possessed a curiosity about the world that seemed limitless. He was special, even as a small child. Sarah used to say he was going to change the world somehow. He did change the world, my world certainly. And now I understand that he's still changing it, through Ada, through this partnership we're building. The revelation had transformed their situation completely. What had seemed like an impossible challenge from territorial officials now became something much more personal, an attack on family, on blood connections that deserved protection and respect. Mr. Vaughn, Ruth said carefully, I need you to understand that this knowledge might make our situation more complicated rather than simpler. If our family connection becomes public, it might create new problems for your business relationships. Let it, Everett said with sudden fierce determination. I lost my son 8 years ago, and I've spent every day since then wishing I could have done more to protect him from a world that saw his heritage as a limitation rather than a strength. I won't make that same mistake with Ada. Ada had been quiet throughout this exchange, absorbing the magnitude of what she was learning about her own identity and place in the world. Now she spoke with a maturity that surprised both adults. Does this mean we're really family? Not just because of business contracts, but because of blood? Everett's answer was immediate and certain. It means you're my nephew's cousin, which makes you my family in every way that matters. And it means that anyone who wants to interfere with your education or your mother's medical practice will have to go through me first. Ruth felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The family connection would provide them with powerful protection, but it would also expose them to new vulnerabilities. Their enemies could use the relationship to attack Everett's business interests, or to suggest that his support was based on obligation rather than merit. What do we do about Harrison and Clark? She asked, Everett's expression hardened with resolve. We fight them, but not alone and not defensively. I've been thinking about this all afternoon, and I believe our best strategy is to go on the offensive. He moved to his desk and withdrew a folder thick with documents. I spent the day making inquiries about our territorial officials. It seems their concerns about improper social arrangements are rather selective. They've never questioned any of my other business partnerships, even those that might be considered unconventional. Ruth studied the papers he handed her, recognizing legal documents and correspondence that painted a picture of corruption and selective enforcement of territorial policies. They're being paid to oppose us specifically, she realized. By whom? I'm not certain yet, but I have my suspicions. There are people in Kansas City who would prefer to see medical services in frontier territories remain limited and expensive. Competition from well-trained practitioners like yourself represents a threat to their profits. Ada looked between the two adults, understanding that they were planning something that would require courage from all of them. "What are you going to do?" "We're going to Kansas City as planned," Everett said. "You're going to meet with Dr. Blackwell. Your mother is going to pursue her advanced training, and I'm going to have some very direct conversations with certain business associates about the importance of family loyalty." Ruth felt a stirring of hope mixed with determination. "And if they try to stop us?" "Then they'll discover that interfering with my family was a very poor decision indeed." As they prepared to leave the ranch house, Everett handed Ruth a small leather journal. "Sarah kept a diary during the years we were together. I think you should have it. There are stories about Thomas as a young boy, memories of your family, things that should be preserved and shared." Ruth accepted the journal with trembling hands, understanding that she was receiving a piece of her lost sister's life, a connection to family history that she'd thought was gone forever. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For caring about Thomas, for protecting him, for being the father Sarah needed him to have. Thank you for raising such a remarkable daughter and for being brave enough to trust me with your family's future." As they rode back to their cabin through the starlit prairie night, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the strength that came from knowing she wasn't facing the world's challenges alone. Ada was no longer just her daughter, but also Thomas's cousin, part of a family network that included one of the most powerful men in the territory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they rode home as part of something larger than themselves, protected by bonds that went deeper than contracts and stronger than the prejudices of those who would try to limit their potential. The wind whispered through the grass around them, carrying with it the promise of storms to come, but also the certainty that they would face those storms together. As family should, the town meeting hall had never hosted such a crowd. Word had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire that the territorial officials were calling a public hearing about irregular business practices involving Everett Vaughn and Ruth Morrison. By the time the appointed hour arrived, every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, their faces reflecting curiosity, concern, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. Ruth sat in the front row beside Ada, both of them dressed in their finest clothes, as if they were attending church rather than what amounted to a public trial. Everett sat on Ada's other side, his presence a visible statement of solidarity that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone in the hall. The whispers and stares that followed their entrance had been predictable, but Ruth held her head high, drawing strength from the family connection that had changed everything about how she understood her place in the world. Harrison and Clark occupied a table at the front of the hall, flanked by several other men in expensive suits, whose presence suggested that the territorial government was taking this matter very seriously indeed. Sheriff Hayes sat uncomfortably to one side, clearly unhappy about being caught between his duty to maintain order and his personal respect for both Ruth and Everett. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we are here today to address concerns about business arrangements that may violate territorial guidelines regarding appropriate social and economic relationships." The formal language was designed to sound official and legitimate, but Ruth recognized it for what it was, a thinly veiled attack on their right to form partnerships across racial lines. She felt Ada's hand slip into hers and squeeze gently, offering comfort while drawing strength from her daughter's courage. "Specifically," Clark continued, "we have received complaints about Mr. Everett Vaughn's recent contracts with Mrs. Ruth Morrison, arrangements that appear to exceed normal business parameters and may constitute inappropriate social elevation." A murmur ran through the crowd at this direct statement of what many had been thinking, but few had been willing to say aloud. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she also felt something else, anger at the presumption that her qualifications and worthiness could be questioned simply because of her race. Everett stood slowly, his walking cane tapping against the wooden floor as he moved to address the room. "Gentlemen, before you proceed with this hearing, I think it's important that everyone understand the full context of my business relationship with Mrs. Morrison." Harrison's expression grew wary. "Mr. Vaughn, you'll have an opportunity to present your position." "I'll present my position now," Everett interrupted, his voice carrying a steel that reminded everyone present why he'd become one of the most successful ranchers in 3 counties. "Because the information I'm about to share changes the entire foundation of your complaints." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the daguerreotype that Ruth had shown him the night before, holding it up so that the crowd could see. "This photograph shows my late wife, Sarah Whitehorse Morrison, my stepson, Thomas Morrison, and Lieutenant James Morrison. What it also shows, though you might not recognize it immediately, is Mrs. Ruth Morrison's family." A gasp ran through the crowd as people leaned forward to get a better look at the photograph. Ruth felt her heart pounding as Everett continued. "Mrs. Morrison is not some random beneficiary of my charity, gentlemen. She is my late wife's sister, which makes her my family by both blood and choice. Her daughter Ada is my stepson's cousin, my family in every way that matters." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Conversations erupted throughout the hall as people processed this information and its implications. Harrison and Clark exchanged alarmed glances, clearly unprepared for this development. Furthermore, Everett continued, raising his voice to be heard over the crowd, "My decision to invest in Mrs. Morrison's medical practice and Miss Ada's education is not based on charity or inappropriate social elevation. It's based on family obligation and recognition of exceptional ability." Ruth stood beside him, feeling the power of having her relationship to this respected man acknowledged publicly. But more than that, she felt the satisfaction of watching their opponents' carefully constructed argument crumble in the face of information they hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Vaughn," Harrison said, struggling to regain control of the hearing, "family relationships don't negate concerns about proper business procedures. They do when those concerns are based on racial prejudice rather than legitimate regulatory issues," Everett shot back. "Are you suggesting that family members cannot enter into business partnerships? Or are you saying that Cherokee and colored family connections are somehow less legitimate than white ones?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Harrison to choose between openly admitting his racial bias or backing down from his position. Either choice would undermine the authority he'd hoped to establish. Ada stood up beside her mother, her young voice clear and strong in the sudden quiet of the hall. "Mr. Harrison, I don't understand why anyone would object to my getting an education or my mama helping sick people. Isn't that what families are supposed to do, help each other succeed?" The simple question, delivered with the straightforward logic of a child, cut through the adult's complex political maneuvering like a knife. Several people in the crowd nodded approval, while others shifted uncomfortably as they realized how their opposition would sound when reduced to its essential elements. Dr. Mitchell stood from his seat in the middle of the hall. "I'd like to say something, if I may." He walked to the front, his weathered face serious but determined. "I've worked with Ruth Morrison for 15 years. She saved more lives in this community than any doctor we've ever had. And she's done it with less equipment and fewer resources than any medical practitioner should have to manage." He turned to face the crowd directly. "If Mr. Vaughn wants to invest in proper medical facilities and advanced training for someone with Mrs. Morrison's skills, then every person in this room should be grateful. We're not talking about charity. We're talking about improving healthcare for all of us." Miss Eleanor rose next. "And I can tell you that Ada Morrison is the most gifted student I've ever taught. If she has opportunities for advanced education, she'll use them to benefit not just herself, but everyone around her. That's the kind of person she is." One by one, other community members stood to speak. People whose children Ruth had delivered, whose illnesses she'd treated, whose respect she'd earned through years of dedicated service. The hearing that was supposed to end their partnership instead became a testimony to their value to the community. Harrison and Clark found themselves facing not just Everett's wealth and influence, but the genuine support of people who had experienced Ruth and Ada's character firsthand. Their carefully planned attack was dissolving into a public relations disaster that would reflect poorly on the territorial government's judgment and priorities. As the spontaneous testimonials continued, Ruth watched Harrison and Clark grow increasingly uncomfortable. Their confident authority was evaporating in the face of genuine community support, and she could see them beginning to realize that their mission had backfired spectacularly. Tom Henderson stood up from his seat near the back. "I'd like to know who exactly filed these complaints about Mrs. Morrison and Mr. Vaughn, because it sure wasn't anyone from Willow Creek. The territorial government doesn't reveal the sources of legitimate concerns," Clark began. But his answer was drowned out by calls from the crowd demanding transparency. Sheriff Hayes rose slowly, his expression troubled. "Gentlemen, I've been thinking about this situation all week, and I have some questions of my own. In 15 years of law enforcement in this county, I've never received a single complaint about Mrs. Morrison's conduct or Mr. Vaughn's business practices. So I'm wondering why the territorial government is suddenly so concerned about arrangements that benefit our entire community." Everett stepped forward, sensing the moment was right to reveal the information he'd gathered. "Sheriff Hayes raises an excellent point. Perhaps Mr. Harrison and Mr. Clark would like to explain their connection to the Kansas City Medical Association, which has been trying to limit rural medical competition for the past 5 years. Harrison's face flushed red. "Mr. Vaughn, I resent the implication. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Everett produced a folder of documents from his jacket. "I have correspondence showing payments from the Kansas City Medical Association to certain territorial officials for regulatory oversight. I have records of similar interference with rural medical practices in 3 other counties. And I have sworn statements from doctors who were pressured to limit their services to protect urban medical monopolies." The crowd erupted in angry murmurs, as people realized they'd been manipulated by outside interests who cared nothing about their community's welfare. Ruth felt a surge of pride and gratitude as she watched Everett systematically dismantle their opponent's credibility. "Furthermore," Everett continued, his voice rising above the crowd noise, "I have a telegram from the territorial governor's office stating that no official complaints about our business arrangements have been filed through proper channels, which makes me wonder exactly what authority Mr. Harrison and Mr. Clark are claiming to represent." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison and Clark exchanged desperate glances, clearly realizing that their carefully orchestrated attack had not only failed, but had exposed them to serious questions about their own conduct. Ada tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, does this mean we won?" Ruth looked at her daughter's hopeful face and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the certainty that right had triumphed over wrong through the combined efforts of good people standing together. "Yes, baby, I think it does." Dr. Mitchell approached the officials' table with the deliberate movement of a man who had made an important decision. "Gentlemen, I think it's time for you to leave our community. You've wasted enough of our time with your illegal interference in legitimate business arrangements." "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison blustered, "you can't simply dismiss territorial authority." "I can, when that authority is fraudulent." Sheriff Hayes joined Dr. Mitchell at the front of the hall. "And I can arrest people who misrepresent their official status to interfere with lawful business activities." The threat was unmistakable, and Harrison and Clark clearly realized that their position had become untenable. They gathered their papers with as much dignity as they could muster, while the crowd watched in satisfied silence. As the false officials prepared to leave, Everett called out one final statement. "Gentlemen, please convey to your associates in Kansas City that the Vaughn family protects its own. Any future interference with Mrs. Morrison's medical practice or Miss Ada's education will be met with legal action and full public exposure of your corrupt activities." The hall burst into applause as Harrison and Clark made their hurried exit, defeated and humiliated by a community that had chosen to support merit over prejudice and family over fear. When the noise finally died down, Tom Henderson stood again. "I'd like to make a motion that this community formally welcome the new medical clinic and congratulate Miss Ada on her educational opportunities." "Seconded," called Miss Eleanor, and the motion passed with overwhelming approval. Ruth felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around the hall at faces that reflected genuine warmth and support. These were the same people who had whispered about her dinner at the Vaughn ranch just weeks ago. But their experience of the officials' attempted manipulation had opened their eyes to the real forces that threatened their community. Everett placed a gentle hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Are you ready to go to Kansas City tomorrow? Ready to begin the work we've been planning?" "More than ready," Ruth replied. "I think we all are." Ada stood and faced the crowd with the poise of someone far older than her 12 years. "Thank you all for standing up for us today. I promise I'll use every opportunity I'm given to learn and grow and help this community however I can." The applause that greeted her words was warm and sustained, the sound of a community embracing its own and investing in its future. As people began to file out of the hall, many stopped to shake hands with Ruth and Everett, to congratulate Ada, and to express their support for the medical clinic and educational initiatives. Sheriff Hayes approached them as the crowd thinned. "Mrs. Morrison, I owe you an apology. I should have investigated those men's credentials before allowing them to organize this hearing." "No apology necessary, Sheriff. Sometimes we need to see deception exposed before we can recognize truth clearly." As they prepared to leave the hall, Ruth reflected on how completely their situation had changed. What had begun as a desperate confrontation with hostile officials had ended as a community celebration of their partnership and its promise for the future. Walking out into the warm evening air, with Ada between them and the stars beginning to emerge overhead, Ruth felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that they had not only survived their challenge, but had emerged stronger and more united than before. Tomorrow would bring new adventures and opportunities. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they had faced adversity together and prevailed through the power of family, community, and unwavering commitment to what was right. 6 months later, Ada stood on the front porch of the new Morrison Medical Clinic, reading the brass nameplate that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The words, "Ruth Morrison, M.D., Chief Medical Officer," still filled her with wonder and pride. Her mother had returned from Kansas City, not only with advanced training from Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell herself, but with the confidence that came from knowing her skills were recognized and valued by the finest medical minds in the country. The clinic occupied a handsome new building on Main Street, its clean white walls and modern equipment a testament to what could be accomplished when talent met opportunity and family support. Ruth's practice had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined 6 months ago, serving not only Willow Creek but surrounding communities, whose residents traveled considerable distances to receive care from someone they'd heard could work miracles with limited resources. Ada's own transformation had been equally remarkable. The private tutoring Everett had arranged had accelerated her learning beyond what anyone had thought possible, and she was already studying subjects typically reserved for much older students. More importantly, she moved through the world with a confidence that came from knowing she belonged to a family that would support her ambitions and protect her from those who would limit her potential. Her legs had continued to strengthen, aided by physical therapy techniques that Ruth had learned in Kansas City, while she still used a walking stick for longer distances. A beautiful carved piece that Everett had commissioned as a gift, she no longer needed the crutches that had once seemed like permanent fixtures in her life. "Miss Ada," called Tommy Hendricks as he ran up the clinic steps. "My ma sent me to ask if Dr. Morrison can come look at the new baby. She's worried about his breathing. Ada smiled at the title that had become natural for everyone in town to use. "I'll get her right away." "She's in the office reviewing patient files." Ruth emerged from the clinic, carrying her leather medical bag, now expanded with the finest instruments and supplies money could buy. But her movements still carried the same purposeful grace that had characterized her work for 15 years. And her eyes still held the compassionate intelligence that made people trust her with their most precious concerns. "How's little William doing, Tommy?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "Better today, Mom." "Well, says you've got magic in your hands." Ruth laughed gently. "Not magic, son. Just training and experience. But I'm glad he's improving." As they walked toward the Henderson home, Ruth reflected on the changes that had transformed not just her own life, but the entire community. The medical clinic had brought jobs and prestige to Willow Creek, attracting families and businesses that might otherwise have settled elsewhere. Ada's academic achievements had inspired other parents to invest more seriously in their children's education, and Miss Eleanor had been able to expand the school's curriculum with new books and materials funded by a scholarship program that Everett had established. But perhaps the most profound change had been in the community's understanding of what was possible when talent and determination were given proper support. The story of how the Morrison family had overcome opposition and achieved success had become a source of local pride, proof that their small town could produce extraordinary people when given the chance. That evening, the three of them gathered for their weekly dinner at the Vaughn Ranch, a tradition that had evolved naturally from their business partnership into something that felt like the family gatherings Ruth had dreamed of but never thought she'd experience again. "I received a letter from the University of Chicago today," Everett announced as they settled on the back porch with their coffee. "They're very interested in Ada's application for early admission to their preparatory academy." Ada's eyes lit up with excitement, though she'd learned to temper her enthusiasm with careful consideration of all implications. "Do you think I'm ready for something like that?" "I think you're ready for any challenge you choose to accept," Ruth replied. "But the choice has to be yours. We've learned that opportunities are gifts, but they don't have to be accepted just because they're offered." Everett nodded approvingly. Wise words. Thomas would have appreciated that distinction. They often spoke of Thomas now, sharing memories and stories that had been preserved in Sarah's diary and in Everett's recollections. The boy had become a bridge between their past and future, a reminder that family connections could transcend death and create legacies that honored those who had gone before. "I want to go," Ada said thoughtfully, "but I also want to come back. This is my home, and these are my people. Whatever I learn, wherever I study, I want to bring that knowledge back to help our community." Ruth felt her heart swell with pride at her daughter's mature wisdom. The girl who had once cried desperately for her crutches had become a young woman who understood that true strength came not from independence alone, but from the willingness to both give and receive support from those who loved her. As the evening stars began to emerge over the prairie, Ruth pulled Sarah's diary from her pocket, a habit she'd developed of carrying it with her as a reminder of family connections that endured beyond death. The final entry, written just days before Sarah's death, contained words that had become a source of comfort and guidance. "Whatever challenges Thomas faces in this world, I pray he will remember that he comes from people who survived and thrived despite every obstacle placed in their path. Strength is not about standing alone. It's about knowing when to lean on others and when to offer support in return. Love is not about perfection. It's about accepting help when it's needed and giving help when it's possible." "Mama," Ada said quietly, "do you think we made the right choices?" "All of them, from the very beginning?" Ruth looked at her daughter's thoughtful face, then at Everett's kind eyes, then out at the vast prairie that stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. "I think we made brave choices, baby. And I think brave choices, made with love and good intentions, have a way of becoming right choices, even when we can't see the outcome at the beginning." Everett raised his coffee cup in a gentle toast. to brave choices, to family, and to the future we're building together. As they touched their cups together in the soft evening light, Ruth felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing they had traveled a difficult path and emerged not just intact, but strengthened. The crutches that had once seemed like symbols of limitation had become stepping stones to independence. The community that had once whispered with suspicion now spoke with pride about their accomplishments. Most importantly, the love that had sometimes felt like cruelty had been transformed into the kind of support that honored both strength and vulnerability, recognizing that true healing often required not just determination, but the wisdom to accept help when it was offered with genuine care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight they sat together as family should, grateful for the past that had shaped them, confident in the present they had built together, and hopeful about the future that awaited them all.